The flagship broke apart without a sound. I was watching it through the forward viewport when it happened. One moment the shining Grace was there, her running lights steady against the black, 4,000 souls breathing and living inside her hull. The next moment, a line of white light punched through her from bow to stern, and she folded inward like paper crushed in a fist. There was no explosion, no fire. In the vacuum of the Dren corridor, the largest ship in our convoy died in perfect silence, and those 4,000 people became 4,000 ghosts between one heartbeat and the next. My name is Vayari. I am a junior navigation officer aboard the medical transport Pale Current, and I am telling you this because someone must, and because I am one of the few who survived long enough to understand what happened in the hours that followed. We were a 7-ship convoy crossing the Dren corridor, that miserable stretch of lawless space between Thalassic territory and the Oreni border. It is the kind of space that appears on navigational charts with warnings in 3 languages, the kind of space where signal buoys go dark and nobody investigates. Every pilot knows to avoid it. Every shipping company tells its captains to take the long way around. But we did not have the luxury of the long way around, because the long way added 40 days to our journey, and we were carrying people who did not have 40 days to spare. The Pale Current was loaded with medical supplies, bound for the colony on Vethsera, where a respiratory plague had already claimed 600 lives and was accelerating. 2 of our sister ships carried colonists, families who had sold everything they owned for a new start on a world that needed them desperately. And in the belly of the cargo hauler Driftmark, packed into converted freight containers fitted with emergency life support and second-hand thermal blankets, were 312 refugee children from the border conflict on Thesson Minor. Children with no families left. Children who had already survived one disaster and were now sailing through the most dangerous corridor in the sector, with nothing between them and oblivion but a thin hull and a prayer. We had hired 2 mercenary gunships as escorts. The Varric brothers, freelance muscle, with a decent reputation and enough firepower to discourage casual raiders. They flew ahead and behind the convoy formation, running active scans, projecting an image of competence and threat. They were supposed to be enough. They were not. The Vraxian marauders decloaked at 3 points around the convoy, in the same heartbeat that the kinetic lance struck the Shining Grace. 3 raider ships, angular and scarred, their hulls painted with kill markings that I could read even at distance. These were not amateurs. These were career predators, who had been hunting the Dren corridor long before our convoy entered it, and who had chosen their ambush point with the careful patience of professionals. The Varric gunships tried to respond. I watched one of them pivot and fire a desperate salvo, beam weapons splashing uselessly against the nearest raider's shields, before a concentrated return volley cut it in half. The other lasted perhaps 4 seconds longer. It managed to raise shields, managed to accelerate toward the nearest raider, and then 3 torpedoes struck it simultaneously from 3 different angles, and it became a spreading cloud of superheated debris, tumbling outward in silence. 4 minutes. That is how long it took for our entire defensive structure to collapse. In 4 minutes, we went from a protected convoy to a scattered collection of crippled ships drifting in hostile space, with no one to defend us and no way to run. The Pale Current took a glancing hit across our port side. I felt the ship shudder beneath my feet, heard the groan of structural members bending in ways they were never designed to bend, and then the emergency alerts began flooding every screen on the bridge in cascading waves of red and amber. Our FTL drive was gone, not damaged, not degraded, not repairable, gone. The entire housing assembly had been sheared clean off the hull by the kinetic impact, spinning away into the void. Long-range communications were down. Life support was failing in the lower decks, atmosphere bleeding out through a fracture somewhere below us that our sensors could locate, but our damage control teams could not reach. Captain Thesic, our commanding officer, gripped the edge of his console and stared at the tactical display with all 4 of his eyes wide open. I had served under him for 2 years. I had seen him navigate asteroid fields and solar storms and customs disputes with 3 hostile species simultaneously. I had never seen him afraid before that moment. Around us, the convoy was in chaos. 2 cargo haulers had collided while trying to evade the initial attack, their hulls locked together in a twisted embrace of bent metal, and ruptured compartments that neither could escape. The colonist transports were dark, running on emergency power, their engines cold and their crews huddled in whatever compartments still held atmosphere. The Driftmark, carrying the children, had taken no direct hits but was drifting without propulsion, caught in the debris field of our destroyed flagship, her hull slowly rotating as she moved through the expanding cloud of wreckage that had once been 4,000 living people. And the Vraxians were circling. They did not finish us off. That was the part that made my blood run cold, that transformed the fear in my chest from hot panic into something deeper and worse. A pirate who wants your cargo will destroy you and pick through the wreckage. A raider who wants your fuel will cripple your engines and drain your tanks. But the Vraxians did neither. They positioned themselves at 3 points around the convoy, weapons hot, engines idling, and they waited, patient, unhurried, like predators who had cornered prey and saw no reason to rush. Then the broadcast came. It was in broken galactic common, spoken with the harsh consonants of Vraxian speech, and it said simply, "Surrender your ships, open your airlocks, and prepare to be boarded. Cooperate and you will live. Resist, and you will watch your ships burn one by one, starting with the one carrying the smallest passengers, until cooperation seems more appealing." Slavers, they were slavers. They did not want our cargo, or our fuel, or our navigation data. They wanted us. They wanted the colonists for labor markets, the medical staff for resale to black market clinics, and the children. The children would fetch the highest price of all, because refugee children with no families and no records are the easiest to disappear into the dark economy of the outer systems, and no one ever comes looking for them. Captain Thesic closed his eyes. All 4 of them, slowly, deliberately, as if shutting out the reality of what was happening might somehow change it. Then he opened them and turned to the communications officer. "Can we reach anyone?" The answer was no. Our long-range array was destroyed. The convoy's relay network had died with the shining grace. We could talk to each other on short-range channels, ship to ship, but nothing we had could push a signal past the Dren corridor's natural interference and reach Allied space. We were shouting into a soundproof room. The senior surviving captain, a weathered thalassic trader named Doran, aboard the colonist transport Wayward Star, sent a tight-beam message to all remaining ships. He had done the mathematics. The nearest thalassic patrol fleet was stationed at Outpost Carroll, 90 hours away at maximum FTL. Even if we could somehow get a message out, even if that message traveled at the speed of light, help would not arrive for nearly 4 days. We did not have 4 days. We did not have 4 hours. The Vraxians were already launching boarding craft, small armored shuttles separating from the raider hulls and moving toward the convoy in a slow, deliberate formation. I sat at my navigation console and stared at the instruments that were still functioning. Most of them were useless now. Navigation tools are not much help when you have no engine, no destination, and no future longer than the next hour. But as I looked at the wreckage of my station, turning the problem over in my mind simply because the alternative was sitting still and waiting to be taken, an idea began to form. I am not an engineer. I am not a communications specialist, but I understand signal propagation, because plotting a course through deep space requires understanding how energy moves through the void, how frequencies interact with interstellar medium, how far a pulse can travel before it degrades into noise. And I had spare parts. The navigation backup array used a low-frequency emitter for position calibration, and with some modification, some very rough and very desperate modification, it could be turned into a distress beacon. It would not be strong. It would not reach Outpost Carroll or any thalassic station, but it could scream into the void on every open frequency for perhaps 2 or 3 light hours in every direction, and maybe, just maybe, someone would hear it. I told Captain Thesic what I was doing. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but something caught between the two. "There is nothing out here, Vayari. No stations, no patrols, no trade routes. The Dren corridor is empty." "I know," I said. "You are wasting time we do not have." "I know that too." He did not stop me. Perhaps he understood that I needed to do something, anything, rather than sit at a dead console and wait for the airlock to open and the slavers to walk in. Perhaps he simply did not have the energy to argue. I worked fast. My hands were shaking, and the tools kept slipping in my grip because my palms were slick with sweat. I pulled the calibration emitter from the backup array, rerouted its power supply through the emergency bus, bypassed 3 safety interlocks that would have prevented the modification under normal circumstances, and tuned its output frequency to broadcast on the universal distress band. It was ugly work. An engineer would have been horrified by the exposed wiring and the bypass connections held together with emergency adhesive. But when I powered it on, the emitter hummed to life, and a distress signal began pulsing out into the darkness in every direction. No identification, no coordinates, just a raw, repeating scream in the electromagnetic spectrum that said, "Someone is here, someone is in danger, someone needs help." I watched it pulse on my screen. Once, twice, 10 times, 100 times. Nothing came back. The void was silent, the corridor was empty, just as Captain Thesick had said, just as the navigational charts promised, just as everyone who had ever studied this region of space had confirmed. On the tactical display, the Vraxian boarding craft were closing on the drift mark. They were going for the children first. Of course they were going for the children first. Secure the most valuable cargo before anything else. Standard slaver doctrine. I had studied it in my academy courses, read about it in dry academic language that had failed entirely to convey the horror of watching it happen in real time. I felt something inside me go very cold and very still. Not despair exactly. Something past despair. Something on the other side of it, where the fear burns itself out and leaves behind only a quiet, hollow clarity. I understood in that moment that no one was coming. No fleet, no patrol, no miracle. We were alone in the darkest stretch of space in the sector, surrounded by slavers who wanted to sell our children, and nobody in the entire galaxy knew we were here, or cared that we were dying. The distress beacon pulsed again, and again, and again. And then, on the 347th pulse, something pulsed back. I blinked. I thought the instrument was malfunctioning. I ran a diagnostic, and the diagnostic came back clean. The return signal was real. Something at the far edge of my beacon's range had received the distress call and responded with a single electromagnetic ping, an acknowledgement, a confirmation that the signal had been heard and understood. I checked the signature against our database. It was not Thalassic. It was not Vraxian. It was not Oreni, or Drathaki, or Cassian, or any of the 47 species whose transponder codes were stored in our records. It matched nothing. It was completely unknown. "Captain," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears. Something just answered. Thesick turned. The bridge crew turned. Everyone stared at my console as I pointed at the single blinking dot at the very edge of our sensor range. Something had dropped out of FTL, something large, something dense, sitting motionless in the void perhaps 3 light seconds from the convoy. And it was running completely dark, no transponder, no energy signature, no communications. By every standard sensor reading, it was not there at all, but my beacon had touched it, and it had answered, and now it sat in the blackness like a held breath. Thesick leaned over my shoulder. "What is that?" "I do not know," I said. We watched the dot together, this impossible contact sitting at the edge of the debris field, and we waited for it to move, to speak, to do anything at all, but it simply sat there in the darkness, silent and still, and watched us with whatever eyes it had. And for reasons I could not explain, the cold stillness in my chest began to change shape, not into hope, not yet, but into something that felt like the memory of hope, or the possibility that hope might still exist somewhere in the universe, even here, even now, even in the Dren corridor, where nothing good had ever happened to anyone. Something was out there. Something had heard us, and it was coming closer. The unknown contact did not move for 6 minutes. I counted every second, because counting was the only thing keeping me from screaming. 6 minutes of absolute stillness, while the Vraxian boarding craft continued their steady approach toward the drift mark, and its cargo of 312 children, who did not know that their future was being measured in minutes. Then, on the bridge of the pale current, every functioning sensor I had went blind for exactly 1 second. The screens flickered to static, the tracking displays collapsed into noise, and for 1 heartbeat, I was looking at nothing but dead instruments. When they came back online, the contact had moved. It was no longer at the edge of sensor range. It was inside the debris field, less than 2,000 kilometers from the nearest Vraxian raider, and it was still running dark. It had crossed that entire distance in a single second, without any detectable propulsion signature, without leaving any trail, without disturbing any debris in its path. That should not have been possible. No engine technology I knew of could move a ship that size that fast without leaving some kind of trace, some exhaust plume or gravitational disturbance or radiation pulse. But there was nothing. It had simply been in one place and then it was in another, as if the space between the 2 points had briefly ceased to exist. The Vraxians noticed it too. Their sensors must have registered the same impossible transit that mine had, because the nearest raider ship, the one I had designated Alpha on my tactical display, broke away from its position and pivoted hard to face the unknown contact. Its weapons were already charged from the convoy attack, and I watched its communication array light up as it broadcast a territorial warning on all open frequencies. The message was blunt and carried the weight of Vraxian arrogance. Identify yourself immediately, state your affiliation, or be treated as hostile and destroyed. Silence. The unknown contact said nothing. It did nothing. It hung in space like a piece of the void itself had decided to become solid, and it ignored the Vraxian demand as completely as if the broadcast had never been sent. The second demand was louder, angrier, accompanied by targeting locks that I could see on my passive sensors as bright spears of scanning energy, sweeping across the unknown ship's hull. The Vraxians were painting the contact with weapons-grade tracking beams. The universal language of, "We will fire on you." Still nothing. Not a sound. Not a signal. Not a flicker. I had managed to get a passive optical sensor working during the initial repairs. Nothing more than a basic camera, slave to a manual tracking mount. I pointed it at the coordinates of the unknown contact and magnified the image as far as the resolution would allow, pushing the optics past their intended limits until the image was grainy and flickering but recognizable. What I saw made no sense. The ship was matte black. Not dark gray, not deep blue, not the charcoal of weathered hull plating. True black, absolute black, the kind of black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, that seemed to pull the surrounding starlight into itself and give nothing back. It was angular in a way that no civilian vessel would ever be, with flat planes and sharp edges and intersecting geometries that looked more like a mathematical theorem than a starship. There were no running lights, no viewports that I could see, no markings of any kind, no registry numbers, no national emblems, no manufacturer logos, nothing that would tell an observer who had built this thing, or where it came from, or what it wanted. It did not look like a ship that carried weapons. It looked like a ship that was a weapon. Every line of its hull was shaped for a single purpose. Every surface angled to scatter sensor returns into nothing. Every component integrated into a design philosophy that prioritized one thing above all others: lethality. I ran its silhouette against our navigational database. No match. I ran it against the military registries of every major species. No match. I ran it against the restricted files, the classified databases that most navigation officers never access, because they contain the speculative ship designs and intelligence assessments of species we have limited contact with. The match came back partial, flagged with a security warning I had never seen before in my career. Terran military vessel. Human design, heavy frigate variant, configuration unknown, extensive modifications beyond any registered specification. The database entry was years out of date and contained almost no useful information, just a silhouette comparison that was close enough to trigger the match, but not close enough to identify the specific class or purpose. A human warship. Here in the Dren corridor, where no human vessel had any legitimate business being, where no human colony existed within 50 light-years, where no human trade route had ever been charted or proposed or even theorized about. "Captain," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "It is human." Thesic stared at me. "That is not possible. The database gives a partial match, Terran military design, heavy frigate classification, or larger. There are no humans in this sector. There have never been humans in this sector. There is one now." On the tactical display, the Vraxian Raider Alpha was losing patience. It had repeated its identification demand 3 times with no response, and now I watched its weapon systems cycle to full power, capacitors charging, torpedo tubes opening. The Vraxian commander had apparently decided that anything running dark in his hunting ground was either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be taken, and either outcome required shooting first. A warning shot lanced across the void, a bright streak of superheated plasma that passed within 100 meters of the black ship's hull, close enough to leave residual heat traces on the surface plating. It was a statement of intent. The next one would not miss. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The void was silent, the black ship hung motionless, and then it changed. I do not know how else to describe it. The hull itself seemed to shift, panels sliding and rotating with mechanical precision, so smooth it looked organic, and from beneath them emerged weapon systems. Not 1 or 2 discrete turrets, dozens. Beam emitters, kinetic accelerator tubes, torpedo launchers, point defense arrays bristling with rapid-fire barrels, and several larger installations that I could not identify at all, massive structures that looked like they could crack a moon's crust from orbit. They deployed across the entire surface of the hull simultaneously, unfolding like the thorns of some deep space predator that had been sleeping with its armor closed and was now fully, terrifyingly awake. I counted the weapon hardpoints. I counted them again, because the first number could not possibly be right. I counted them a 3rd time, using a different tracking method, marking each one individually on my screen. The number did not change. That single ship was carrying more individual weapon systems than the entire Vraxian raider group combined. More firepower than most capital ships I had ever seen on a sensor display. It was not a frigate. Whatever designation the outdated database had given it, this thing was something else entirely, something that the galactic community had apparently never properly cataloged. The bridge of the pale current went completely silent. Even the emergency alarms seemed to quiet, as if the ship itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then the human warship spoke. A single transmission, broadcast on every open frequency simultaneously, unencrypted, in accented but perfectly clear galactic common. The voice was female, calm, and carried the weight of absolute authority. This was not a request. This was not a negotiation. This was a statement of fact, delivered by someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and was prepared for all of them. All hostile vessels, cease fire and withdraw from the convoy. Release any boarding craft. You will not receive a second warning. The words hung in the silence of the bridge like smoke. Captain Thesic gripped the edge of his console so hard I heard the composite material creak under his fingers. The communications officer turned to look at me with an expression I could not read, something between disbelief and the faintest, most fragile edge of hope. The Vraxians responded the way Vraxians always respond when someone challenges them in territory they consider theirs. The lead raider, Alpha, turned its full weapons array on the human ship and fired everything it had. A barrage of energy beams and kinetic projectiles and guided torpedoes streaked across the gap between the 2 vessels, a wall of destruction that would have gutted a heavy cruiser and left nothing but slag. What happened next took 11 seconds. I know because I checked the sensor logs afterward, again and again, trying to convince myself that the data was real and not some glitch born from damaged instruments. The human warship did not evade. It did not raise shields. It did not turn or roll or present a narrower profile or do any of the things that every tactical manual in the galaxy says a ship should do when fired upon. It accelerated, directly into the incoming fire, straight at the Vraxian raider, closing the distance at a speed that made my navigation training scream that the inertial forces alone should have killed everyone aboard 10 times over. The point defense systems activated. Not 1 battery, not 2, but every defensive system on the hull cycling simultaneously, creating an overlapping field of fire that covered the ship's entire approach vector. Every incoming projectile, every energy bolt, every guided torpedo was tracked, targeted, and neutralized before it could reach the hull. Not deflected, not absorbed by shields, destroyed in flight, swatted out of existence with a precision that looked almost contemptuous, like someone brushing insects from their arm without breaking stride. Not a single shot reached the hull. Not one. Then, the human ship fired back. Once. A single beam, so bright and so concentrated that my optical sensor overloaded and went white for a full second, the camera's safety protocols slamming a filter into place to protect the imaging array. When the image returned, the Vraxian Raider Alpha was in two pieces. The beam had entered through the forward shields as if they were not there, as if they were a suggestion rather than a barrier, passed through the armored hull, through the weapons deck, through the reactor compartment, and out the other side in a clean, straight line of total destruction. The ship split along the cut, both halves drifting apart in slow silence, atmosphere and bodies and debris venting into the void. 11 seconds. From the first Vraxian shot to the Raider's total destruction. 11 seconds. On the bridge of the pale current, someone made a sound. I think it was the medical officer. It might have been me. It was a sound that did not have a word in my language, something between a gasp and a sob and a prayer. The noise you make when you have been drowning in darkness, and your head suddenly breaks the surface, and there is light and air, and the possibility that you might live. The two remaining Vraxian raiders went silent. Their weapons powered down, their boarding craft, still in transit toward the driftmark and its cargo of children, stopped dead in space, engines cutting out, hanging motionless in the debris field like insects frozen in amber. The entire raider formation went still, paralyzed, as if the destruction of their lead ship had severed some central nerve that connected them all. The human warship repositioned. It moved with that same impossible smoothness, crossing kilometers in seconds, without any visible engine flare or acceleration pulse, and placed itself directly between the Vraxian raiders and the convoy, between the predators and the prey, between the slavers and the children they had come to take. The voice broadcast again, the same female voice, the same unshakable calm, as if the complete destruction of a warship in 11 seconds was merely an administrative matter to be noted and filed. That was your second warning. There will not be a third. Captain Thesic released his grip on the console and straightened slowly. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing in our shared experience that had prepared us for what we had just witnessed. Then he said, very quietly, "Do not celebrate yet, Vayari. We do not know what they want. Humans are unpredictable. They may not be here to save us. They may simply want us for themselves." I understood his caution. I shared it, in the rational part of my mind that was still capable of strategic thinking, despite the adrenaline flooding my system. We knew almost nothing about humans. They were a young species by galactic standards, barely a few centuries into their expansion beyond their home system. They had a reputation for being simultaneously friendly and terrifying, generous and ruthless, warm and cold, depending on circumstances that no other species seemed able to predict or understand. The galactic consensus on humanity was simple: do not provoke them, do not assume you understand them, and hope they remain interested in trade rather than conquest. But the irrational part of my mind, the part that had been watching Vraxian boarding craft closing on a ship full of orphaned children with no one to stop them, did not care about caution. That part of me wanted to believe, needed to believe, was already believing whether I gave it permission or not. The Vraxians did not retreat, but they did not advance. A tense standoff settled over the debris field, the convoy suspended between two forces, neither of which we understood or controlled. Then the human warship did something that broke every tactical doctrine I had ever studied, something that no military vessel should do in the middle of a hostile engagement in contested space with enemy forces still active and dangerous. It opened its hangar bay. The bay doors slid apart, spilling warm golden light into the cold darkness of the debris field, and from inside the warship, small craft began to emerge. My sensors classified them automatically, cross-referencing their profiles against the database with mechanical efficiency. They were not fighters. They were not gunships. They were not assault shuttles loaded with marines and breaching equipment. They were medical transports, 4 of them, painted white with red markings, carrying no weapons of any kind, heading directly toward the convoy on approach vectors that placed them between the Vraxian raiders and our crippled ships. I stared at the display. I stared at it until the images blurred, and I realized my eyes were wet, and I did not bother to wipe them because there was no one on that bridge who would have judged me for it. because every single one of them was looking at the same display with the same expression. Captain Thesick stood beside me, watching the medical shuttles approach, and he said nothing for a very long time. Then he reached over and placed one of his 4 hands on my shoulder, and he squeezed once, gently, the way he might comfort a frightened child. "Open the airlock," he said quietly. "Let them in." The first human I ever saw in person was a medic named Lucy Penn. She came through the airlock of the Pale Current, carrying a trauma kit that looked like it weighed nearly as much as she did, slung across her back on a reinforced frame that pressed into her spine with every step. She was short by any species standard, barely reaching my shoulder, with dark hair pulled back from her face in a tight knot, and quick brown eyes that took in the entire scene on our ship in a single comprehensive sweep. She wore a uniform that was practical, rather than decorative, covered in pockets and attachment points for medical instruments, and there was dried blood on her sleeves that was not her own, and not from our species. The corridor outside the airlock was lined with our wounded, 46 crew members, with injuries ranging from plasma burns to fractured limbs to decompression trauma, laid out on emergency pallets because our medical bay had lost power in the attack, and the backup generators did not have enough capacity to run both life support and medical equipment simultaneously. They looked up at this small alien creature walking through their ship, and I saw confusion and fear on their faces, because none of them had ever seen a human in person before, and because a stranger boarding your crippled ship in a crisis zone is always a threat until proven otherwise. Lucy Penn did not wait for permission. She did not introduce herself formally. She did not ask who was in charge, or request a briefing on the tactical situation, or demand to see identification or authorization. She looked at the nearest wounded crew member, a propulsion technician named Kethis, who had second-degree burns across his chest and arms from a ruptured plasma conduit, and she dropped to her knees beside him and opened her kit. She said something in her own language, a brief phrase that I did not understand, but whose tone told me everything I needed to know about what she was feeling. It was the same sound I had heard from our own medics when they pulled survivors from the wreckage of damaged sections, something between anguish and fierce determination, the voice of someone who is furious at the suffering they are seeing, and absolutely resolved to fight it with everything they have. She pulled a device from her kit that I had never seen before, a flat handheld scanner that she passed over Kathis's body in slow, careful movements, hovering centimeters above his skin. It projected readings onto a small screen mounted on her wrist, and I watched her study the data with an intensity and focus that reminded me of our own senior physicians. She was reading his biology in real time, analyzing an alien physiology she had almost certainly never encountered before in clinical practice, interpreting organ functions and metabolic signatures and cellular chemistry that bore no resemblance to her own species. And she was doing it on the move, without reference materials, without consultation, adapting her medical knowledge to an entirely foreign biological framework. Within 3 minutes, she had applied a burn treatment compound from a tube in her kit, spreading it across Kethis's wounds, with gentle, practiced hands. The compound began cooling his damaged skin immediately, drawing out heat and inflammation with visible speed. He gasped, and then he sighed, and the tension that had locked his muscles for hours released as the pain receded for the first time since the attack. Lucy Penn patted his arm once, gently, said something soft in her language that sounded like reassurance, and moved to the next patient without looking back. She was not alone. Behind her came 3 more medics and 2 engineers, all human, all carrying equipment, all moving with a purpose and coordination that I found deeply unsettling. Not because it was hostile, because it was so practiced. These people had done this before. They had boarded crippled alien ships and treated wounded of species they had never seen, and repaired technology they had never studied. And they had done it enough times that it was routine. That word kept recurring in my mind. Routine. This was routine for them. The engineers headed straight for our life support systems without being directed, without asking for schematics, without hesitating at a single junction. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Sam Crowley, with hands the size of my face and a tool belt that seemed to contain an impossible number of specialized instruments, took one look at our failing atmospheric processors, muttered something to himself, and began working. He moved through our engineering section as if he had memorized the layout, finding access panels and junction boxes with an ease that bordered on suspicious. Within 20 minutes, he had our lower deck life support stabilized and functioning at 80% capacity. He had accomplished in 20 minutes what our own engineering team had been unable to do in 2 hours of desperate effort with their own systems. I asked him how he knew where to find the atmospheric processors without being shown. He looked at me and grinned, and his smile was so unexpected, so warm, so completely at odds with the situation we were in, that I almost forgot we were standing in a crippled ship surrounded by hostile forces. "The layout is similar to a Cassian medical frigate," he said, impassable galactic common, with a strange accent that softened his consonants. "We trained on captured schematics. Most species use the same basic engineering logic for life support placement. Different configurations, same principles." "You trained on alien ship schematics?" "We train on everything." He shrugged as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe, and went back to work, humming a melody under his breath that I did not recognize but found strangely comforting. In the cargo bay, the medics set up a triage station with terrifying speed. They unfolded portable treatment beds from compact cases, deployed sterilization fields using handheld emitters, arranged their equipment in a pattern that spoke of hundreds of hours of drill and practice, every piece exactly where it needed to be, every medic knowing their position without being told. Lucy Penn directed the operation with clipped, efficient phrases, switching between her own language and galactic common without hesitation, addressing our crew in one tongue and her team in another, never losing track of either conversation. I watched her treat a thalassic child who had been brought from the refugee section of the Driftmark, transferred to the Pale Current by one of the human medical shuttles. The child was perhaps 6 years old, small even for her age, with a fractured arm and eyes so wide with terror that the whites showed all the way around. She had been crying for hours, and her voice was hoarse, and she flinched away from every hand that reached toward her. Lucy Penn knelt in front of her. Not beside her. In front of her. At eye level. Making herself small. Making herself unthreatening. Something changed in the human woman's face. A softening of the clinical efficiency. A shift from medic to something older and more fundamental. She reached into her kit and pulled out a small piece of something wrapped in shiny material, and she offered it to the child with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. A smile that needed no translation, because kindness looks the same on every face in the galaxy. The child took it hesitantly. It was food of some kind, a dense brown bar that the child sniffed with her sensitive olfactory membranes, and then bit into carefully. Her eyes widened, and she looked up at Lucy Penn with an expression of pure, startled surprise, the first expression other than fear that I had seen on a refugee child's face in weeks. Lucy Penn set the broken arm while the child was distracted by the food. It was done so gently, so smoothly, with such precise and careful movements, that the child barely noticed. By the time the splint was applied and the bone stabilizer activated, the child was sitting in Lucy Penn's lap, eating the rest of the bar, and had stopped crying for the first time in days. I was summoned from the cargo bay by Captain Thesick. The human warship's commanding officer wanted to speak with someone from the convoy who could communicate in Galactic Common, and I was the only officer on the Pale Current who could do so with any fluency. Our communications officer had been wounded in the attack, and was currently being treated by the human medics, who had somehow determined the correct dosage of pain relief medication for a species whose biology they had encountered for the first time 30 minutes ago. The connection was audio only, routed through one of the human shuttles because our own communications array was still non-functional. The voice on the other end was the same one that had broadcast the warnings to the Vraxians. Calm, measured, with a cadence and rhythm that suggested someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. "This is Commander Grace Harland, Terran Deep Patrol Vessel Blackthorn." "Who am I speaking with?" "Junior Navigation Officer Vayari, Medical Transport Pale Current. I am acting as communications liaison for the convoy." "Understood, Vayari. I need a full status report on every ship in your convoy. Hull integrity, life support capacity, engine status, and most importantly, casualties. How many wounded, how many critical, and how many children are aboard the Driftmark?" She asked about the children specifically, not the cargo, not the medical supplies, not the strategic or economic value of the convoy. The children. I gave her the numbers. 7 ships in the original convoy, 1 destroyed, 2 locked together and unable to separate, 4 damaged but structurally intact. Estimated casualties across all surviving ships, 214 wounded, 41 critical, and an unknown number killed aboard the Shining Grace, estimated at over 4,000. And 312 refugee children aboard the Driftmark, uninjured but without power, heat, or functioning life support for more than another 6 hours. There was a pause after I finished. Not a long one, perhaps 2 seconds of silence. But something shifted in Commander Harlan's voice when she spoke again. Something fundamental, like a door closing and locking. The calm remained, the professional composure held, but beneath it was something harder and colder, like the sound of a blade being drawn from its sheath. 312 children, she repeated. Not a question, a confirmation. Yes, Commander. Understood. Then we are not leaving until every one of them is safe. Hold your position, Vayari. Do not deviate. Do not negotiate. Do not surrender. We have this under control. The Vraxian raiders had been silent during this exchange, holding their positions at the edges of the debris field, their boarding craft still frozen in space between the convoy and the raider ships. They were not attacking, but they were not leaving either. I assumed they were waiting, calculating, trying to determine whether a single human warship, however powerful, was worth the risk when the prize was this valuable. They made their decision within the hour. 4 new contacts dropped out of FTL at the far edge of my sensor range, arriving in a staggered formation that spoke of coordinated military planning. Vraxian signatures, all of them. 4 more raider ships, heavier than the original 3, with weapons loadouts designed for ship-to-ship combat rather than convoy interdiction. Reinforcements. The original raiders had called for help while the standoff played out, and help had arrived. 7 Vraxian warships now faced a single human vessel. Captain Doran aboard the Wayward Star broadcast a panicked message on the convoy-wide channel. His voice cracked and wavered as he spoke. He was the senior surviving captain, the one responsible for the lives of every person in the convoy, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing him. He ordered all ships to prepare for immediate surrender. He said that the human warship had fought with extraordinary skill, but that one ship could not face 7, no matter how powerful it was. He said that surrender was the only option that did not end with all of us dead in the void. Commander Harlan's response came over the same open channel, cutting through Captain Doran's transmission like a blade through soft cloth. All convoy vessels, this is Commander Harlan. Hold your position. Do not surrender. Do not open your airlocks. We have this under control. Doran sputtered a protest. 7 warships, he said. 1 human vessel, he said. The mathematics of the situation were clear and inarguable. Commander Harlan did not argue with him. She simply said, in a voice that carried the faintest edge of something that was not quite amusement, Captain, respectfully, your mathematics are incomplete. On my sensor display, the Blackthorn began to change again. The hull structures I had not been able to identify earlier, the ones that looked like oversized antenna arrays or sensor amplifiers, unfolded from the dorsal surface of the ship and oriented themselves outward in a pattern that looked almost ceremonial. They pulsed once, twice, 3 times, broadcasting on a frequency so far outside my instrument's normal operating range that I could barely detect it as a faint shimmer at the edge of my equipment's capability. Then the human warship went quiet, and the void answered. New contacts. Not 1, 6. Dropping out of FTL in a perfect hexagonal formation around the Vraxian reinforcement group, arriving within 90 seconds of each other, with a timing precision so exact that it could only be the result of pre-planned coordination, ships that had been waiting at specific rally points for exactly this signal. 6 more human warships, each as black and angular and bristling with weapons as the Blackthorn. They appeared out of nothing, out of the empty darkness that the Vraxians had believed was theirs, as if the void itself had grown teeth and closed them around the raider flotilla. I stared at the tactical display and felt the blood drain from my face and my heart's hammering against my ribs. The Blackthorn had not been alone. It had never been alone. It was the visible piece, the single ship that showed itself, that allowed itself to be seen and challenged and fired upon, while the rest of the pack waited in the dark. I understood the design with a clarity that made my stomach turn. The humans had not stumbled onto this engagement. They had not been passing through. They hunted these corridors deliberately, methodically, patiently. And the Blackthorn was the bait. The one ship they allowed the predators to see. The one they used to draw the enemy in, to make them commit forces, to make them call for reinforcements and reveal the location and strength of their reserves. So the rest of the pack could close the trap. 7 human warships now surrounded 7 Vraxian raiders. The geometry was flawless. Every escape vector was blocked. Every raider was covered by at least 2 human weapons arrays with overlapping fields of fire. The Vraxians were not merely surrounded, they were caged. The Vraxian flotilla began broadcasting surrender codes. Every ship, all 7 of them, transmitting on emergency frequencies, announcing their intention to lay down arms and submit to boarding and inspection. Commander Harlan's response was 2 words, spoken in a voice that carried no anger, no triumph, no visible emotion at all, just the flat, absolute certainty of someone who had already decided how this was going to end before it began. Too late. I had been told, by instructors and diplomats and veterans who knew more about the galaxy than I did, that humans do not pursue retreating enemies, that they are fierce in defense but merciful in victory, that they fight only when provoked and stop fighting the moment the threat is neutralized. Those stories were incomplete, or perhaps the truth was more precise than the stories allowed, and the precision made all the difference. Humans do not pursue enemies who retreat before crossing a certain line. I did not know exactly where that line was drawn, or what principle defined it. But I knew now, watching 7 human warships close on the Vraxian flotilla, with weapons hot and targeting locks engaged, that the Vraxians had crossed it. They had crossed it the moment they launched boarding craft toward a ship full of orphaned children. They had crossed it the moment they threatened to sell those children into slavery. And once that line was behind them, there was no going back over it. There was no surrender that would be accepted. There was only consequence. The engagement began at 14:07 convoy time and lasted 14 minutes. I watched it from the bridge of the Pale Current, surrounded by my crewmates, all of us pressed against the sensor displays like survivors watching a storm from inside a shelter, unable to look away. The human ships did not fight the way I expected. I had anticipated overwhelming brute force, a coordinated barrage that would reduce the Vraxian flotilla to expanding clouds of debris. Instead, the humans fought with surgical precision that was far more frightening than any display of raw power could have been. They targeted engines first. Concentrated beams, precisely calibrated to penetrate specific armor thicknesses, struck the thruster arrays of the outermost Vraxian ships and cut through their drive systems with the delicacy of a surgeon removing damaged tissue from a patient. The raiders lost propulsion in seconds, their ships drifting helplessly as their ability to maneuver vanished. Then weapons. The human ships moved through the flotilla like pack hunters through a scattered herd, each one selecting a specific target, isolating it from the group, and systematically stripping away its ability to fight. Beam emitters were cut from hulls with individual shots that severed mounting brackets without damaging the surrounding structure. Torpedo tubes were welded shut by focused thermal beams. Point defense turrets were picked off one by one, each turret destroyed individually, while the adjacent hull plating remained untouched. They were not trying to destroy the Vraxian ships. They were capturing them. They wanted the slavers alive. They wanted prisoners, not wreckage. And that realization, more than anything else I had witnessed, chilled me to the core. I understood then why Commander Harlan had said too late when the Vraxians tried to surrender. She had not been refusing their capitulation out of cruelty or bloodlust. She had been telling them that the outcome was no longer negotiable. They were going to be taken, boarded, searched, and held accountable for what they had done and what they had intended to do. The only variable was how much damage they absorbed in the process. 3 Vraxian ships were disabled and boarded within the first 8 minutes. Human assault shuttles latched onto their hulls with magnetic clamps, and within seconds I could see atmosphere seals forming around emergency airlocks as the boarding parties cut their way in. What happened inside those corridors I could not see, but I could imagine it, and my imagination drew from every story I had ever heard about human close-quarters combat. The Vraxians were larger than humans. They were stronger. They had natural armor plating and biological weapons built into their physiology. None of that, according to every account I had ever read, mattered. Two raiders attempted to flee. They redirected all remaining power to backup drives, overloading their emergency propulsion systems to generate enough thrust to break through the encirclement. They made it perhaps 300 kilometers, their engines flaring white-hot with unsustainable output, before human ships ran them down, matching their speed with almost insulting ease, and crippling their drives with precisely placed shots that left the rest of each ship intact and its crew alive. The final two raiders, cornered and desperate, and perhaps driven by the Vraxian cultural terror of capture, chose to fight. They turned their remaining weapons on the human boarding parties, firing into the narrow space between their own hulls and the approaching assault shuttles, willing to risk their own structural integrity to kill the humans trying to board them. The response was instant, overwhelming, and absolute. The two human warships covering those targets did not hesitate, did not issue warnings, did not negotiate or offer quarter. They fired with full force, and both Vraxian raiders detonated simultaneously, their reactors breaching under the concentrated barrage. The message was unmistakable: surrender and be taken, or threaten our people and cease to exist. There was no middle ground. 14 minutes. When it was over, 5 Vraxian ships were captured, 2 were destroyed, and not a single convoy vessel had taken any additional damage. The debris field that had been our graveyard was now the Vraxians' prison. The aftermath was quiet in a way that made my skin prickle. The weapons went silent. The human ships repositioned themselves around the convoy in a protective formation, their armaments still active, but no longer firing, watchful rather than aggressive. Medical shuttles resumed their work, returning to the convoy ships as if the battle had been merely an interruption in their real mission. I saw the Vraxian prisoners for the first time when human marines escorted a group of them through the pale current on their way to a holding area aboard one of the human vessels. The Vraxians were bound at the wrists with restraints I did not recognize, some kind of flexible material that contracted when the prisoners struggled, their weapons confiscated, their posture broken. These were the beings who had killed over 4,000 people aboard the Shining Grace, who had planned to enslave our colonists, who had intended to sell our children. Now they stumbled through our corridors with their heads down, eyes wide with a fear I had never seen on Vraxian faces before, surrounded by human soldiers who looked at them with an expression I can only describe as controlled contempt. Not rage, not hatred, something quieter and more devastating than either. The look of people who had seen this particular species of evil before, many times, and were no longer surprised by it, only determined to end it, methodically, every single time they encountered it. One Marine paused near the entrance to the cargo bay, where the refugee children were sheltering. She was tall, with close-cropped red hair, and a scar across her jaw that spoke of a previous engagement where things had gotten close enough for blades. Her name tag read, Webb. She looked through the doorway at the children huddled inside, small faces turning toward her, and then she looked at the Vraxian prisoners being led past, and her jaw tightened until I could see the muscles flexing beneath her skin. She said nothing. She did not need to. Everything she was thinking was written on her face, in a language that transcended species and needed no translation. The repairs continued through the following hours. The human engineers worked alongside our own crews with a generosity of expertise and materials that continued to astonish me. Sam Crowley, the engineer who had fixed our life support, was now leading a combined team that was jury-rigging our FTL drive using components from the Blackthorn's own stores. He had somehow identified compatible elements in the human ship's engineering inventory, and he was fabricating custom adapter circuits by hand, soldering molecular connections with steady fingers while explaining every step of the process to our own engineers in patient, careful galactic common. I was invited to the Blackthorn. Commander Harland wanted to coordinate the convoy's departure route, and she requested my presence aboard her ship to review navigational options through the remainder of the Dren corridor. Captain Thesick approved the visit, though I could see the lingering caution in his expression, the old soldier's instinct that said, trust no one completely, especially not in a crisis. We trusted the humans now, but trust earned in extremity is fragile, and Thesick was too experienced to set his guard down entirely. The shuttle ride to the Blackthorn took 4 minutes. When the shuttle bay doors opened and I stepped aboard the human warship, I stopped walking and simply stood there, staring. I had expected a weapon's interior, cold metal, harsh lighting, bare functionality stripped down to the minimum required for combat operations. A machine designed for killing and nothing else, as brutal inside as it was outside. What I found was something I was not prepared for. The corridors were clean and well-maintained, painted in muted blues and grays that I found surprisingly calming, with overhead lighting that mimicked natural warmth rather than the harsh white of most military vessels. There were personal touches everywhere, small things that spoke of people who lived aboard this ship for months at a time, who had made it not just their posting but their home. Photographs mounted on bulkhead walls, images of landscapes and cities and faces, and gathered groups that I did not recognize but understood instinctively were pieces of a world called Earth, carried into the void as anchors against the dark. A mess hall that smelled of food being cooked from actual raw ingredients, not synthesized from nutrient paste, with pots on heating elements and steam rising, and the sound of conversation drifting through the doorway. A small alcove near the crew quarters, where actual plants grew under ultraviolet lights, green and vibrant and alive, completely out of place on a warship, and yet somehow the most right thing I had ever seen. These people lived here. They had made this ship their home in the deepest sense, and they had carried that home into the darkest corridors of space, and they had decorated it with photographs, and fed it with real food, and filled its corners with growing things, because the alternative was letting the darkness in, and they had apparently decided that the darkness was not welcome. Commander Grace Harland met me in her ready room, a small office adjacent to the bridge, with a desk covered in star charts and a viewport that showed the damaged convoy hanging in space outside. She was not what I had expected from her voice. She was smaller than I had imagined, lean and compact, with lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at tactical displays and too many nights with insufficient sleep. Her hair was brown streaked with early gray at the temples, and her hands, when she clasped mine in the human greeting custom, were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who worked with them and had been working with them for decades. But her eyes were what stayed with me. They were blue, the color of shallow water over white sand, and they were kind. Genuinely, unmistakably, profoundly kind. There was steel behind them, certainly. I had heard that steel in her voice when she said "too late" to the Vraxian surrender. But the kindness was the foundation, the bedrock on which the steel was built, and I understood in that moment that Grace Harland was dangerous, not despite her kindness, but because of it. She fought the way she did because she cared, and there is nothing in the galaxy more dangerous than someone who fights because they care. We discussed navigation routes, alternative paths through the remainder of the Dren corridor that would avoid known raider staging areas and debris fields. She was thorough and knowledgeable, pulling up charts of the corridor that were more detailed and more current than anything in our own database. She knew this space intimately. She had been patrolling it for months, mapping its hazards, tracking its predators, learning its rhythms the way a hunter learns the rhythms of the forest. When the planning was done and the route was set, I asked the question that had been burning inside me since the Blackthorn first appeared on my sensors. Why? She looked at me, and her expression shifted slightly, becoming more open, more present. Why are you here, Commander? There is no treaty between the Thalassic Confederation and humanity that requires you to protect our ships. There is no payment, no trade agreement, no political obligation, no strategic interest that I can identify. You are patrolling lawless space at the far edge of the explored galaxy, protecting convoys that belong to species you have barely had contact with. Why? Grace Harland leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Not because she was struggling to find an answer. I could see in her face that she already had one. She was deciding how much to share, how deep to go, how much of her people's soul to reveal to a stranger. 200 years ago, she said, our oceans were lawless. Not all of them, and not everywhere, but in enough places and across enough water that it mattered. There were traffickers who moved people across the sea in chains. There were raiders who attacked fishing boats and merchant ships. And for a long time, a long, shameful time, many people looked the other way, because the ocean was vast, and the ships were small, and it was easier to pretend it was someone else's problem. She paused, and her gaze moved to the viewport, to the darkness beyond. It took us generations to change that. Generations of ships and sailors, and ordinary people spending their lives in the dark places, on patrol, watching and waiting, so that the people who used those waters could do so without fear. And even after we succeeded, we remembered. We carved the memory into our institutions, and our training, and our culture, because we never wanted to forget what it costs when nobody is willing to patrol the dark. She looked back at me, and those kind, steel-backed eyes held mine with an intensity that I felt in my chest. Space is an ocean, Vayari, a very large one, with very dark places, and somebody has to patrol it. Somebody has to be willing to sail into the corridors where the predators hunt, and say, "Not here. Not today. Not while we are watching." I did not have a response to that. I am not sure one existed in any language. The repairs took 12 more hours. The human engineering teams worked through the entire night cycle without stopping, rotating crew members through rest periods but never allowing the work to pause. Sam Crowley fell asleep at his workstation at one point, slumping over a half-finished circuit board, and was gently lifted and carried to a cot by one of his colleagues, who then sat down at the station and picked up the soldering tool and continued exactly where Sam had left off, without missing a single connection. I returned to the pale current and found my ship transformed. Life support was fully operational on every deck. The hull breach on the lower level had been sealed with a composite patch that our engineers said was structurally stronger than the original plating. The medical bay was powered and functional, our wounded treated and stabilized and resting, and in the cargo bay, arranged in neat rows on thermal blankets provided by the human medics, the refugee children were sleeping, peacefully, deeply, for the first time since the attack, perhaps for the first time in weeks. I stood at the viewport and looked out at the Blackthorn, floating in the darkness beside us, her hull scarred and weathered, but her weapons still active, still scanning, still standing guard between the convoy and anything that might emerge from the void. And I saw, at the viewport next to mine, a cluster of thalassic children pressed against the transparent panel, waving at the human warship. Their small hands moved back and forth, catching the interior light, and as I watched, a viewport on the Blackthorn illuminated briefly, and I could see human figures standing behind it, waving back. One of them held up a sign. It was hand-drawn on what looked like a piece of packing material, written in clumsy but legible thalassic script. The letters were formed by someone who clearly did not read or write our language, and had copied the characters carefully from a translation guide, taking the time to get each one right. It read, "You are safe now." Something inside my chest cracked open. Not grief, not fear, not simple relief, though relief was part of it. Something larger than all of those things combined, something I did not have a word for in my language, or in any language I knew. A feeling that the universe, for all its cruelty and vast indifference, still contained people who would fly into the darkest corners and stand between the helpless and the hungry, not because they were ordered to, not because they were compensated, but because they believed that someone should. I stood at that viewport for a long time, watching the children wave, watching the humans wave back, and I let that nameless feeling fill my chest until it ached with something that was not pain. The convoy was ready to move. It had been 18 hours since the Blackthorn had emerged from the void, and in that time the human engineering teams had accomplished what our own crews privately described as impossible. Every surviving convoy ship had functioning FTL drives. Some were held together with jury-rigged adapter circuits, fabricated components, and what Sam Crowley cheerfully described as creative engineering, but they were functional. They would hold. The wounded had been stabilized, the critical cases transferred to the Blackthorn's own medical bay, where human doctors worked alongside our physicians, in a collaboration that neither species had ever attempted before. The dead had been counted, their names recorded, their loss acknowledged, and the children were fed, warm, sleeping and safe. Sam Crowley personally walked me through the modifications he had made to the Pale Current's FTL drive. He looked exhausted beyond description, dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises, his hands trembling slightly from too many consecutive hours of precision work, on too little rest, and too much stimulant. But he smiled when he showed me the final connection, the last circuit that brought our drive online for the first time since the ambush, and his smile had the satisfied warmth of a craftsman showing off work he was proud of. "She will hold," he said, patting the drive housing with the affection of someone speaking about a beloved companion. "Not forever, mind you. You will need a proper refit when you reach port, but she will get you home." The convoy formed up for the FTL jump in a configuration that the human navigators had designed. 7 human warships took escort positions around us, 3 ahead to clear the path and detect threats, 2 on each flank providing cover, 2 trailing behind to guard the rear. Commander Harland informed me via communications that the Blackthorn's wolf pack would escort us the entire way to the border of Allied Thalassic territory. Every ship, every soul. No vessel left behind, no shortcut taken, no risk accepted that could be eliminated. Captain Thesick stood on the bridge of the Pale Current and watched the human formation take shape on our tactical display. He had been quieter than usual since the battle, more contemplative, his 4 eyes focused inward as often as outward. When the formation was complete, all 7 human warships locked into their positions around the convoy like the walls of a moving fortress. He turned to me and spoke in a voice I had never heard from him in 2 years of service. It was the voice of a man reconsidering something fundamental that he had believed for most of his life. "I have served 40 years in space," he said. 40 years, across 3 different fleets, under 6 commanding officers, through 2 wars, and more border disputes than I can count. I have seen military forces from a dozen species fight for territory, for resources, for political advantage, for cultural dominance, for revenge. I have never, in all those decades, seen a military force fight that hard for people who were not their own. Not once. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was even quieter, carrying the weight of a concession that cost him something to make. "I was wrong about them, Vayari. I was wrong, and I am glad that I was wrong." The FTL jump was initiated. The stars stretched and blurred, and the Dren corridor, that miserable graveyard of a transit route, vanished behind us as the convoy and its escort punched through the fabric of space toward safety. I felt the familiar lurch in my stomach as the drive engaged, accompanied this time by an unfamiliar vibration from Sam Crowley's improvised components, a subtle thrumming that was not quite right, but was close enough. The drive held. The ship moved. We were going home. The transit should have taken 6 hours at the reduced speed our damaged drives could sustain. 4 hours in, with the convoy deep in FTL, and safety only 2 hours away, the Wolfpack detected something that turned my blood to ice. A Vraxian dreadnought, a full capital ship, 3 times the mass of the Blackthorn, carrying enough weapons to crack orbital defense platforms and shatter battle stations. It was positioned in normal space directly along our projected exit vector, sitting at the precise coordinates where our convoy would drop out of FTL, waiting with the patient stillness of a predator that knows exactly where its prey will emerge. It was a trap. The slavers had a mothership, a command vessel that controlled the raider groups operating throughout the Dren corridor, and it was waiting for us. Waiting to reclaim its captured raiders, waiting to recover the convoy that its raider groups had failed to take, waiting for the children who had been promised to buyers across a dozen black market worlds, buyers who had already paid deposits, buyers who would not accept failure gracefully. The Dreadnought had known we would come this way because there was only one viable exit vector from the ambush site with our damaged drives, and the Vraxians knew these corridors better than anyone alive. They had probably known our route before we did. The convoy could not change course. Sam Crowley's repairs were brilliant and creative, but they were also fragile. Our FTL drives were locked into a single jump solution, a straight-line transit from the combat zone to thalassic space. Any attempt to alter course mid-transit, to deviate even slightly from the calculated path, risked catastrophic drive failure across multiple ships. Drives that were being held together by adapter circuits and creative engineering do not handle course corrections well. We would drop out of FTL exactly where the Dreadnought expected us to emerge, directly within its engagement range. Commander Harlan's voice came over the fleet channel, and I noticed for the first time that it carried the faintest trace of fatigue beneath its characteristic steadiness. She had been awake for over 20 hours, commanding a battle, coordinating repairs, planning routes, and now facing a capital ship with a damaged wolf pack. But the fatigue did not touch her composure. She laid out the situation in clear, precise terms that every captain in the convoy could understand. The dreadnought outmassed any 3 ships in the wolf pack combined. Its weapons were designed for capital ship engagement, for breaking through the hardened defenses of military installations. A direct confrontation would be costly. But the convoy could not deviate, and the dreadnought was between us and safety, and there was no path around it. She reorganized the wolf pack with 3 sentences. No debate, no committee, no lengthy tactical discussion. 3 sentences, and the formation shifted. 4 ships would maintain escort formation around the convoy, shielding it during the FTL exit and covering any vessel that lost power or suffered drive failure during the transition back to normal space. 3 ships, the Blackthorn, the Harrow, and the Cairn, would break formation the moment the convoy dropped out of FTL and engage the dreadnought directly, drawing its fire and its attention away from the civilian ships. I opened a private channel to the Blackthorn. I do not know what protocol I violated by doing so, what regulations I broke, or what chain of command I circumvented. I did not care. Commander, the dreadnought outmasses your 3 ships combined. Its weapons are designed for destroying fortified targets. Its armor is rated against capital-class munitions. You cannot fight it at those odds. Grace Harlan's voice came back with something new in it. Not bravado, not false confidence. Something that existed on the other side of fear, in the place where calculation and commitment and acceptance merge into a quiet, unshakable certainty, and beneath it, so faint I almost missed it, a trace of genuine amusement, the kind you hear from someone who has been underestimated many times before and has come to find it entertaining. Mass is not everything, Vayari. The convoy dropped out of FTL. The Vraxian dreadnought was waiting. It filled the forward viewport like a wall of metal and malice, its weapon arrays already glowing with stored energy, its targeting systems sweeping across the convoy like searchlights hunting through fog. It was enormous, a mountain of armor and guns that dwarfed everything around it, a fortress built for the void that radiated menace with every line of its hull and every pulse of its active sensors. The 3 human warships broke formation. They did not charge recklessly. They did not scatter in panic. They deployed in a triangular formation that shifted and rotated as they moved, each ship covering the blind spots of the other 2. Their movements synchronized with a precision that made them look like 3 extensions of a single mind. They accelerated toward the dreadnought on converging vectors, spreading apart just enough to force the capital ship to divide its targeting between 3 fast-moving threats. The dreadnought fired first, a massive barrage, dozens of weapon systems activating simultaneously, filling the space between the capital ship and the approaching human vessels with a storm of energy beams and kinetic rounds and guided torpedoes, a curtain of destruction designed to overwhelm through sheer volume, to saturate an area so completely that nothing could survive within it regardless of speed or agility. The human ships flew into that storm. They did not try to avoid it entirely. They threaded through it. The 3 vessels moved in a weaving, spiraling pattern that placed each ship in the fleeting gaps between incoming fire, exploiting the brief windows where one volley had passed and the next had not yet arrived. They rotated their hull facings in real time, presenting their thickest armor plates to the heaviest incoming rounds, angling deflection surfaces to send glancing hits skidding off into the void. And they shared data, targeting information, damage reports, threat assessments, all flowing between the 3 ships on a communication link, so fast and so seamlessly that their responses seemed to precede the dreadnought's attacks, as if they were reacting to shots before they were fired. The Blackthorn took a hit. A heavy kinetic round, one of the dreadnought's main battery projectiles, struck the starboard hull amidships and tore a section of armor plating away in a burst of debris and venting atmosphere. The impact would have crippled most ships. The Blackthorn shuddered, listed briefly to port, and then corrected its course, and kept coming. It did not slow. It did not turn. It did not retreat. It accelerated harder, closing the distance to the dreadnought, its point defense systems working at maximum capacity, swatting down incoming projectiles with mechanical precision. The Harrow and the Cairn split wide, flanking the dreadnought on opposite sides, pouring coordinated fire into its shield generators, with volleys timed to land simultaneously from 2 different angles. The dreadnought's shields flickered under the synchronized assault, held, flickered again, as the human ships adjusted their fire, probing with different frequencies and power levels, testing the shield harmonics, looking for resonance points and weaknesses. They were not trying to overwhelm the shields through brute force. They were trying to understand them, and with each volley, each adjustment, each test, they were getting closer. The Blackthorn drove straight up the center. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. A heavy frigate, already damaged from the earlier engagement, trailing atmosphere from a hull breach, charging directly at a capital ship that outmassed it by a factor of 3. The dreadnought concentrated its forward batteries on the approaching threat, hammering the Blackthorn with everything it could bring to bear, and I watched hull breaches multiply across the human ship's frame like cracks spreading through ice. Atmosphere vented from a dozen points simultaneously. A secondary explosion rippled across the port side as an internal system failed under the punishment, sending a shower of debris spinning away into the void. Warning lights that I could see even through the optical sensor flickered across the hull as damage control systems fought to keep the ship together. And still it came. Still it accelerated. Still it fired. Every remaining weapon on its battered hull cycling continuously, pouring energy into the dreadnought's forward shields with relentless, unwavering determination. The Harrow and the Cairn reached their optimal flanking positions and fired simultaneously. Not at the shields this time. At the specific emitter arrays that generated the shields, the physical structures bolted to the dreadnought's hull that projected the defensive barrier. Precision shots, guided by targeting data shared from the Blackthorn sensors, striking the exact mounting points where the shield generators connected to the capital ship's superstructure. The dreadnought's shields did not fail gradually. They did not weaken or flicker or fade. They collapsed all at once, like a dam breaking, the entire defensive envelope vanishing in a cascade of dying energy, and the massive ship was suddenly exposed, its hull unprotected for the first time in the engagement. The Blackthorn was less than 500 meters away when the shields fell. Point-blank range by any definition of capital ship combat. The kind of distance where individual hull plates and viewport frames are visible to the eye. The kind of distance that exists only when someone has decided that surviving the next 30 seconds is less important than what they can accomplish in those 30 seconds. Commander Grace Harland fired everything the Blackthorn had left. Every weapon system that was still functional discharged simultaneously. Beam weapons, kinetic accelerators, torpedo launchers emptying their magazines, point defense arrays repurposed for offensive fire, everything the ship possessed concentrated on a single point on the dreadnought's naked hull. The reactor housing, the armored chamber deep within the capital ship that protected its primary power core, the one system that could not be damaged without catastrophic consequences for the entire vessel. The reactor housing cracked, not catastrophically, not in the way that would trigger a core breach and an explosion that would consume everything within 1,000 kilometers. It cracked precisely, a controlled failure that severed power distribution pathways and sent cascading shutdowns racing through the dreadnought's systems like a wave of darkness spreading through a lit building. Engines died, weapons went dark, shield emitters that had nothing left to project powered down permanently. Lights flickered across the massive hull and went out section by section, deck by deck, until the dreadnought was dark, drifting, dead in space. Not destroyed, broken, defeated so thoroughly that it would never fight again without months in a shipyard and a complete reactor rebuild, but left intact enough that its crew would survive, that its environmental systems would keep them alive until someone came to collect the wreckage. Even now, even at point-blank range with the enemy helpless and the battle won, the humans had measured their final strike with enough precision to avoid total annihilation. They had broken the ship without killing everyone aboard. That required a kind of control that I did not fully understand, and found deeply, profoundly unsettling. The Blackthorn drifted beside the dead dreadnought, and the damage she had taken was visible even from the convoy's distance. Scorched and crumpled hull plates, gaping breaches in 3 separate sections, atmosphere still venting from wounds that the damage control teams had not yet managed to seal. She was battered and bleeding and barely holding her structure together, a warship that had pushed herself past every reasonable limit and then kept pushing because there were people behind her who needed her to keep going. But she was still flying, still broadcasting, still maintaining her position between the convoy and the broken dreadnought, still on guard. The convoy crossed into Thalassic territory 20 minutes later. I had never been so relieved to see the familiar blue glow of Thalassic navigation buoys on my sensor display, those steady, reliable markers that meant safety, sovereignty, civilization, home. The Thalassic patrol fleet arrived at the border 12 minutes after we crossed it. 3 cruisers and 6 frigates, the force that had been stationed 90 hours away at Outpost Carroll when the ambush began. They had received a long-range transmission from the Blackthorn, sent hours ago through those mysterious antenna arrays, and they had come as fast as their drives could carry them. They were too late, but they came. The Thalassic admiral, a decorated officer named Vorish, who commanded from the cruiser Eternal Tide, hailed the convoy and then stopped speaking mid-sentence when his sensors showed him what was escorting us. 7 matte black warships of unknown configuration, one of them visibly damaged and trailing debris, floating in perfect formation around a battered civilian convoy, weapons still active, sensors still scanning, crews still alert and watchful, despite hours of combat and sleepless work. I imagine the sight was unlike anything the Admiral had encountered in his career. Commander Harland hailed the Admiral and formally transferred escort responsibility. Her voice was the same as it had been from the first moment I heard it. Steady, professional, utterly composed, as if she had not just fought a dreadnought at point-blank range in a ship that was held together by emergency welds and the stubbornness of her crew. Admiral Vorish asked who they were. It was not a hostile question. It was the stunned, almost reverent inquiry of a military professional confronted with something entirely outside his experience and his expectations. Grace Harland answered with her ship's designation, her rank, and a single phrase that she delivered as if it explained everything. Because in her mind, it apparently did. Commander Grace Harland, Terran Deep Patrol, Vessel Blackthorn, Corridor Security. As if this were routine. As if hunting slave raiders in lawless space, fighting capital ships at suicidal range, and protecting alien children who had no one else to protect them, were just another entry in the patrol log, another day in the schedule, another dark corridor checked and cleared. Before the human ships departed, I sent a personal transmission to the Blackthorn, not an official communication, not a formal diplomatic message bearing the authority of the Thalassic Confederation. A personal message, from Vayari, Junior Navigation Officer, nobody of consequence in the grand hierarchy of galactic civilization, to Grace Harland, the woman who had come out of the void when nobody else was coming. Commander, Grace, I do not have the words to thank you for what you have done. I am not certain the words exist in my language, or in any language I know. You saved 312 children today. You saved every soul in this convoy. And you did it because you chose to. Not because anyone required it of you. Not because any treaty compelled you. Not because any payment was offered. You chose to come into the dark, and you chose to stay, and you chose to fight, and you chose to bleed for people you had never met. I want you to know that I will remember this for the rest of my life, every detail, every moment, and I will make certain that everyone who hears this story understands what happened here, what you did, who you are, what it means. I paused, and then I asked, because I needed to know, because the thought of never hearing her voice again was suddenly unbearable in a way I could not fully explain. Will I ever see you again? The response came after a moment. Grace Harland's voice, tired now, the exhaustion finally breaking through the composure she had maintained for 20 hours of crisis and combat, but warm. Not professional warm, not diplomatic warm. Genuinely, humanly warm. The warmth of someone who has given everything they have and has found that they still have kindness left to give. If you are ever in trouble in the dark, Vayari, put out a signal. We are always listening. The Wolfpack powered up their FTL drives. One by one, the dark angular ships turned away from Thalassic space and oriented themselves back toward the Dren corridor. Back toward the lawless dark. Back toward the void where no law operated, and no authority reached, and no civilization extended its protection. Except for these 7 ships and the people who crewed them. The Blackthorn was the last to go. She hung in space for a moment longer than the others, her battered hull silhouetted against the distant stars, trailing wisps of atmosphere from wounds that had not yet fully healed, her lights dim but still burning. I watched her from my viewport and tried to memorize every line of her damaged, beautiful frame. Then her drive engaged, and she vanished. No flash, no dramatic flare of light, just a ripple in the fabric of space, a brief distortion at the point where a ship had been, and then nothing. Empty void, cold stars, silence. As if she had never been there at all, as if the darkness had simply opened to receive her back into itself, and closed behind her without a trace. I stood at the viewport for a long time after she was gone. The Thalassic patrol fleet was forming up around the convoy, signals flying between ships, officers coordinating, the machinery of civilization grinding back into motion around us. We were safe. We were going home. The children were going to live and grow and have futures that the Vraxians had tried to steal from them. And somewhere out there, in the dark between the stars, 7 black ships were sailing back into the lawless corridors to do it all again, to patrol the dark places where no one else would go, to listen on every frequency for signals that no one else could hear, to arrive, without warning and without obligation, in the moments when all hope was lost and no rescue was coming. I wrote my official report that evening, sitting at my navigation console with the bridge lights dimmed and the ship quiet around me. The soft sounds of sleeping children drifting up from the cargo bay below. I wrote it carefully, choosing every word with deliberate precision, because I knew this report would be read by admirals and diplomats and historians, and perhaps by people not yet born, and I needed them to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant. The last paragraph took me the longest. I wrote it and deleted it, and wrote it again, 4 times over, searching for words that could carry the weight of what I had witnessed. This is what I settled on. Let the record show that no rescue was coming. Every authority we trusted, every fleet we relied upon, every treaty we believed in, every institution we had built our sense of safety upon, none of it reached us in time. What reached us was a human warship, emerging from the void, crewed by people who had no obligation to protect us, and every willingness to fight for us. They did not ask for payment. They did not ask for gratitude. They did not ask for political concessions or trade agreements or strategic partnerships. They did not ask for anything at all. They simply appeared in our darkest hour, stood between us and those who would have taken our children, and refused to move until every soul in the convoy was safe. I have traveled far and seen much in my years among the stars, and I tell you now that I have never witnessed anything more extraordinary. Not the beauty of a nebula at dawn, not the silence of deep space between galaxies, not the birth of a star witnessed from the observation deck of a science vessel. The most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed is the sight of a battered human warship, bleeding atmosphere, and running on failing power, placing itself between a dreadnought and a ship full of children who were not its own. I do not know what humanity is building out there in the dark. I do not know how far their patrols extend, or how many wolf packs hunt the lawless corridors, or how long they have been doing this without the rest of the galaxy understanding what they are, or why they do what they do. But I know this much, and I will carry this knowledge for the rest of my life. Whatever humanity is building, however far their reach extends, the galaxy is safer for it. And if there comes a day when the dark places grow quiet, and the lawless corridors are no longer lawless, and the Dren corridor becomes just another transit route, where convoys pass without fear, it will be because of people like Grace Harland, and ships like the Blackthorn, and a species that remembers what it costs when no one is willing to patrol the night. I submitted the report and closed my console. Through the viewport, the stars burned steady and bright against the infinite dark, and somewhere among them, too far away to see, too well hidden to detect, 7 black ships sailed on through the endless, watchful night, guarding corridors that were not theirs, protecting people they had never met, patrolling the dark because someone had to, and because they had decided, long ago and irrevocably, that someone would be them.